At this point, we would like to give way to Embassy Row, where we feature sitting ambassadors in the country. This week, it is our pleasure to bring to our viewers the British Ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Asif Ahmad. Good evening, Mr. Ambassador, and welcome to Business and Leisure's Embassy Row.
Good evening.
Let's start this interview with a little background about your family. Did you come from a big family? Can you give us an idea of your parents as well as your siblings?
Well, my parents actually met in London when my father was working for the BBC World Service. So it's a real sort of one of those love stories where my mother was a singer and my father was a producer. So they met in the studios of radio, which used to broadcast all over the world. And then when they got married in Scotland, they continued to live in London. That's where I was born. And I left the UK after 4 years, traveled all over the world, and came back as a student when I was 17. I have two other sisters. So by Filipino comparisons, it's a modest-sized family but typically like the Filipino side. You know, my father had 6 other brothers and sisters, and we have cousins all over the world. And we have the same system as you have. You know, we look up to our lolos and lolas and titas, and you know, so it's a very, very familiar feeling when you come here.
Mr. Ambassador, please tell us, what's the most significant influence you got from your parents that created the most impact into what you are now?
I tell you, it was a tough lesson to have because I was lucky because I was born in the UK, and then we had a very easy life for the first 13 years. Then, rather by accident, if nothing else, when my father was working in Beijing, there was a civil war in East and West Pakistan, and I was a 14-year-old student, and I witnessed all of that. And thereafter, when a new country of Bangladesh was being created, we basically were left as refugees in the UK. So I went from a very prosperous life to becoming very, very poor. So the only way out for me was education, and so I studied for my A-levels in the UK. I went to university on what's called a pauper's grant, which is the grant that you get when you have no money at all. So from that difficult lesson in life, you know, what I was taught by my parents and everything else is that you have to remain humble, but truly humble, not just say it. You have to understand that what you get, you work for. And then if you are successful, then you have to reach down and pull people up with you and not imagine that success and prosperity is something that you can take for granted. You can lose it just as quickly as you can get it. So I have the privilege of being ambassador to one of the most traditionally powerful countries in the world. It reaches out to places all over the world, does good things around the world. And yet, I never forget that any day now, you know, things could change. So I have this ability to be resilient.
So, Mr. Ambassador, you spent your childhood in the United Kingdom.
Well, the first 4 years. Then I spent time in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Iran, in Japan, China, a little bit of travel in Poland, and when my father was working in Russia. So it was a very international experience, going to international schools. But then really from the age of 17 right up until now, my root and home has been the United Kingdom.
Just briefly, Mr. Ambassador, would you also like to share with us your education?
Yes, because my father was moving from one country to another, I actually had 2 systems of education. I went to the British system first, then I switched to the American international system, then back to the British system again. And then right at the end, after I started working, I was sent by my employer to study in a business school in France also. So I'm lucky in a sense that my education was very international.
Let's talk about your diplomatic career, Mr. Ambassador. Did you actually prepare for being in the diplomatic service? And what made you take this path that you are in now?
Well, it was in my family tradition because my late father was a diplomat for many years. From 1965 until 1984, he was a diplomat for working in different countries. So it was in my upbringing that I realized that this was a good career to have. But when I finished university, I chose a different career. I was a banker in an international bank based in London. And I did that for just under 20 years. And then I made the switch. And I made the switch completely by accident. I was sitting at home reading a newspaper when there was an advert from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is our DFA, which said that for the first time they were looking for people who had already made a career to make a transition. 600 people responded to the advert. 6 people were employed. I was one of the lucky 6. Lucky because I got in 1999 at a fairly senior level, but then I was able to work my way up through the ranks. I worked in the Prime Minister's office and many other interesting assignments. But what is unusual for me is that all 3 of my overseas assignments have been as head of mission. So, I did a short stint in Burma, and then in Thailand, then here. And from here in the Philippines, I moved on to be head of mission in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. So I didn't have to go through the difficult path that many of my colleagues do, which has been a very nice way of progressing.
Mr. Ambassador, is the diplomatic corps your first foray into government service, or did you hold any government position before being a diplomat?
For a very, very brief period of 3 years between banking and becoming a member of the diplomatic service, I worked for an agency in the UK, which is a government agency, which actually provides direct support to small and medium-sized enterprises as a business consultant. So we went around some of the richest and poorest parts of London and helped small businesses, sometimes a one-person business, through to a company that might employ maybe 250 people or so. But that was a real hands-on experience. But it gave me an early taste of working in government. But my entry really in the diplomatic service was through this sudden opportunity that presented itself.
You mentioned a while ago that you were assigned in Asia and you keep on visiting the Philippines years back. So how does it feel that you've been assigned as full ambassador here in the Philippines?
I've actually visited the Philippines every year since 2003. So this was really a home from home rather than a completely new experience. Also, fortunately for me, I had the opportunity for a short while, for 5 months, to pick up some Filipino. So when I arrived here, I actually could speak a little bit. I can certainly follow the news and other developments, which actually helps, because if you're talking to people here, people switch into Tagalog or they switch completely into Filipino. If you're watching TV, or sometimes when you hear people speak, including the president, he switches in and out of languages. I'm one of the few ambassadors who can actually follow what is being said.
Kindly tell us, please, what are your first impressions about the Philippines and how do they compare to what you think now after being exposed closer to what the country really is?
I think when you're far away from this country, and when I say about my memories of this country before 2003, it was very much the images of the 60s, of the ladies with their ternos and the people wearing their barongs, and the tradition you have in musicals with people like Leah Salonga performing in London, in Saigon. So it was a very cultural vision I had of the Philippines. But then when I started visiting here, I saw both the prosperous side of this country, and I also saw abject poverty in this country, both as a visitor and then of course when I arrived here in the Philippines as ambassador. One of the first tragic things that happened here was Typhoon Yolanda, and that brought me and 1,400 British military and aid personnel really face to face with people in very difficult circumstances. So if you like, I've been exposed to the Philippines in almost every walk of life. I've visited schools, I've been to drug rehab centers here, I've been to hospitals, but I've also been to factories and agricultural communities. So I've seen really the country in its full spectrum.
Mr. Ambassador, it's sad to know that you'll be leaving soon after your stay here for 4 years. What do you think are your major achievements during your stay?
Well, I've been very fortunate because I work with a very good team, and my embassy is actually double the size that it was when I first arrived here. When I arrived here, we had 100 people, now we have 200. So that already shows that we were doing a lot more. We had a lot of high-level visits. When I arrived here, the last time a cabinet-ranking visitor from the UK came here was in 1997. But since then we've had 4, and we had Princess Anne here, the Queen's daughter. So that's been good. The other side that's been really striking is our business engagements. In 2015, the Philippines was our second fastest growing market in the world. And also when I arrived here, there were very few Philippine investments in the UK, but now with Emperador, with whiskey, with Mondanisan, with corn, things have really improved. But the other thing that I think is striking is the people-to-people connections. Once a whole range of flight options were established, including direct flights to London. And when we did our big promotions here about the UK, the fact that we grant just about 90% of the visa applications that are made are actually successful. People think it's the other way around. As a result of that, visitors from the Philippines has really shot up quite considerably, maybe 24% increase since I first arrived here. We are the biggest investor here in this country from the European Union. Some 17,000 British people live here. So we've got a lot at stake in this country. But we've also done tough things. The Mindanao peace process. When I was doing the job in London as foreign policy head, I actually got the UK involved in the peace process at the invitation of the Philippine government. And when I arrived here, we continued that process. So if we get to the end result, which is a settlement of the dispute, that'll be really pleasing to achieve.
With your permission, Mr. Ambassador, we'll just take a short break from our very engaging conversation for some program announcements. And when we return, we shall perhaps tackle the different spheres of cooperative efforts that our countries are engaged in and similar future plans. Business and Leisure's Embassy Row with the Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the Philippines, His Excellency Ambassador Asif Ahmad, continues in a moment.